They whispered about a monster crawling out of the Russian night, a peasant beast with eyes that burned like furnace coals. Grigori Rasputin didn't simply walk into rooms, he invaded them. One glance from those hell-lit eyes, and even the bravest aristocrat felt his spine turn to damp paper. The same stare that made peasants clutch their icons made polished noblewomen tremble in places they never admitted existed. Russia had never met a man like this. Big, raw-boned, reeking of earth and sweat. A brute who smelled like he'd lost a lifelong fistfight with a barnyard, and somehow turned that stench into a weapon. Rasputin was filth personified, and he flaunted it. He didn't bathe, ever. He didn't hide his rot behind perfumes or polite excuses. He wore his grime like a crown, daring the dainty courtiers to gag while their wives felt a heat they'd never felt from their powdered husbands. He called it holiness. Cleanliness, he preached, was sin. God made dirt. Washing it away was blasphemy. The holier you were, the dirtier you stayed. And he practiced what he preached. Witnesses said he smelled like goat meat rotting in a fish barrel, an odor that clung to his greasy hair, his lice-crawling beard, his black-rimmed nails. His robe, a peasant's rag worn for months, carried stains no one could identify, and no one wanted to. This wasn't careless neglect. This was psychological warfare. Rasputin understood a primal truth. Disgust grabs the brain and never lets go. If you can't look away, you've already surrendered. The salons of St. Petersburg, built on perfume and protocol, were defenseless against a man who weaponized repulsion. While powdered courtiers drowned themselves in cologne, Rasputin's holy filth crashed their scented world like a blunt instrument. He didn't just break etiquette, he spat in its face and dared anyone to stop him. The women noticed first. They weren't supposed to. Proper society demanded they look, smile, and forget. But here stood a man who refused every rule they lived by, and somehow that refusal gleamed like power. He didn't bow. He didn't apologize. He stared. Those eyes, icy, hypnotic, obscene in their certainty, locked on a woman's soul and stripped it bare. In a world where husbands treated wives like ornamental furniture, Rasputin's unblinking attention felt like oxygen. One look and the boundary between disgust and desire blurred into a dangerous fog. His voice finished what the eyes began. Deep, rough-edged, carrying the accent of mud-choked villages, it slid into the ears of duchesses like a sermon laced with poison. He spoke of sin as a doorway to salvation, of pleasure as a ladder to God. Every syllable sounded like permission to want what polite society forbade. He offered not flowers or flattery, but a gospel of holy corruption. To reach heaven, you must first wallow in the dirt. Within months of stepping into the capital, this unwashed prophet had the aristocracy buzzing like flies over a carcass. Dinner invitations poured in. Noble ladies lined up for blessings from the man who smelled like a nightmare and preached salvation through ruin. The scandal was volcanic. The fascination was stronger. Russia's most powerful families found themselves orbiting a peasant who measured piety by the thickness of his grime. This was no rags to riches fairy tale. This was a hostile takeover by a man who understood that in a world drunk on appearances, the ultimate dominance came from refusing to play the game at all. Rasputin didn't climb the social ladder. He kicked it over, rolled in the mud, and made the empire beg for more. And as the year 1903 bled into the next, the Romanov dynasty, polished, perfumed, and fattened on centuries of power, had no idea that the stink of this holy man would soon seep into the very walls of their palace. Imagine walking into a salon dripping with chandeliers and powdered egos, then watching every jeweled head swivel toward a man who smells like a damp slaughterhouse. That was Rasputin's entrance, a shockwave of stink and audacity that snapped the Russian aristocracy's spine. He looked like a wandering scarecrow dragged through a swamp, hair slicked into greasy ropes, fingernails black as coffin edges. Yet somehow the very people who spent hours polishing their boots and polishing their lies couldn't look away. Disgust locked their gaze, curiosity kept it there. And once he had their eyes, he had everything. The filth wasn't laziness, it was a calculated act of war. Rasputin preached that washing was a betrayal of God, a coward's attempt to outsmart divine design. Dirt, he claimed, was holy. Sweat was sacred. Let the perfume-choked elite choke harder. Every wrinkle of their disgust was proof of his righteousness. The more they gagged, the holier he became. He called it holy filth. His followers whispered the words like a password to secret ecstasy. They didn't just endure his stench, they worshipped it. And women, oh, the women came like moths to the rod. Here was a man who turned every rule of their gilded world into tinder and lit it with a single glance. While their husbands rehearsed empty compliments, Rasputin stared straight into their marrow. Witnesses said his eyes were a trapdoor, icy, bottomless, impossible to escape. In a society where men barely dared a sideways glance, his raw, unbroken stare felt like a forbidden touch. It wasn't polite attention, it was possession. Then came the voice. Deep, melodic, roughened by vodka and dirt. It rolled through drawing rooms like a sermon dragged through a bedroom. He spoke in riddles of God and sin, mixing holy scripture with blasphemous suggestion until the line between salvation and surrender blurred into a single trembling thought. To know God, he would whisper, you must first destroy your shame. Aristocratic women who spent their lives imprisoned in etiquette felt their cages rattle. Every word from his cracked lips sounded like a key. This was more than seduction, it was spiritual blackmail. Rasputin positioned himself as a holy man who could wipe away any stain. These women, trapped in a maze of rigid morality, longed for someone to bless their secret hungers. Rasputin gave them divine permission. Sleeping with him wasn't sin, he insisted. It was a prayer in flesh. To share his bed was to share God. And the terrifying part, he believed it. His conviction burned hotter than any con artist's act. He wasn't merely selling redemption. He lived inside the lie until it became a kind of truth. Soon the salons of St. Petersburg turned into waiting rooms for his guidance. Noble ladies, women who once flinched at the sight of mud, now stood in line for the touch of a peasant who smelled of goat and smoke. Gossip exploded like gunfire, but scandal only sharpened the addiction. The more society sneered, the more his followers clung to him, convinced that persecution proved his holiness. Rasputin thrived on their outrage, feeding on every hissed insult like it was incense. He arrived in the capital a ragged nobody, and within months had a private audience of duchesses begging for blessings that left them shaking. This was no simple tale of lust. It was domination through disgust, manipulation dressed as mysticism. Rasputin cracked a code modern manipulators still fumble. If you can make people crave what revolts them, you own them completely. By the time whispers of his exploits reached the royal palace, St. Petersburg was already infected. The empire's perfumed elite, so proud of their etiquette and elegance, found themselves hypnotized by a man who weaponized filth and called it faith. And behind that reek of goat and vodka, Rasputin was already reaching for something bigger than flesh, the throne itself. Of all the women who melted under Rasputin's foul shadow, none mattered more than Alexandra Fyodorovna, Empress of Russia, the Tsarina herself. But this was no tawdry bedroom conquest. This was a siege of the soul, a mother's desperation stretched over the barrel of fate. Her precious heir, little Alexei, carried a death sentence in his veins. Hemophilia turned every bruise into a threat, every scratch into a countdown. The royal doctors, smug with medals and empty hands, could only shrug as the boy bled behind palace doors. Enter Rasputin, a reeking, lice-riddled peasant claiming he could bend heaven to his will. He appeared when the panic was thickest, smelling like goat rot and forest smoke, eyes glittering with something Alexandra couldn't name but couldn't resist. He promised nothing as crude as medicine. No, he offered prayer, divine intervention, the touch of a holy man who needed no scalpel but God himself. And damn him, it worked. Whenever Alexei's blood threatened to drown him from within, Rasputin would arrive, place those filthy hands on the child, mutter prayers through a mouth stained with wine, and somehow the bleeding slowed, the fever broke, the boy survived. Science had failed, the dirt prophet delivered. Alexandra fell like a stone dropped into black water. Each miracle tightened the rope around her reason. She believed this stinking mystic was heaven's personal envoy, sent to guard her son's fragile life. Every time the court hissed about scandal, she exploded in righteous fury, defending her holy man as if her child's heartbeat depended on it, because in her mind it did. Ministers, generals, even the Tsar himself became background noise compared to the man who could stop the heir's blood with a whisper. Rasputin knew the power of absence. He would vanish for days, sometimes weeks, leaving the Tsarina clawing at the walls of the winter palace in panic. When he finally returned reeking of sweat and wilderness, he claimed he'd been praying alone in the forest for Alexei's health. The disappearing act worked like a drug. Each absence made Alexandra more frantic, each reappearance more miraculous. Gratitude curdled into dependence, dependence into blind obedience. Soon Rasputin had keys to the empire's most guarded rooms. He dined at the imperial table, played with the royal children, whispered advice into the Tsarina's trembling ear. Court officials watched in horror as a peasant, who stank like a wet animal, moved through the palace like he owned it. He offered counsel on everything, from cabinet appointments to military strategy, as if he were the mouthpiece of God. And Alexandra, drowning in fear for her son, listened to every word. His enemies tried to warn the Tsar. They sent letters, begged for audiences, described in nauseating detail the orgies, the bribes, the drunken visions. Alexandra brushed them aside like flies. Her faith in Rasputin was unshakable. To attack him was to attack the fragile lifeline to her child. Her fury scorched anyone who dared question him. Ministers were dismissed. Friends were frozen out. The more the empire howled, the deeper she dug in. By the time Nicholas II left the capital to command troops at the front, Rasputin's grip on the imperial household was iron. He didn't need a crown. He had something far more dangerous. A mother who would defy an entire empire to keep her son alive. Every disappearance, every foul breath, every whispered prayer tightened the chains. The fate of Russia now dangled from the filthy fingers of a man who measured holiness by how long he could avoid a bath. This wasn't romance. This was strategic possession. Rasputin exploited Alexander's terror like a predator savoring a wounded deer. And while the Tsarina defended him against nobles, priests, and even her own husband, the empire around them began to rot, one desperate mother's faith feeding a peasant's unstoppable climb. Before Rasputin slithered into the Winter Palace, he was already rehearsing his chaos in backwater barns and secret cellars. Russia called it a sect. He called it salvation. The rest of the world would recognize it for what it was, a carnival of sin dressed up in holy robes. He gathered peasants, merchants' wives, and thrill-starved aristocrats under the banner of the Dynasty, a breakaway cult that believed the quickest road to God was paved with filth. Their theology was madness polished into a doctrine. Christ died to forgive all sins, so the holiest act of faith was to sin as much as possible, then beg forgiveness with equal ferocity. Sin big, repent bigger, repeat until eternity cracks. Rasputin seized this lunacy and ran it like a maestro of depravity. Nights began with frenzied chanting, bodies whipping themselves into a trance, prayers turning to screams. The rhythm tightened, the air thickened, and the room shifted from prayer meeting to something far more carnal. Confession melted into temptation. Supposed saints swayed like dancers at the edge of a fever dream, eyes half closed, mouths open to whatever divine touch came next. He called it purification through sin. The steps were simple and sickening. First, confession. Each follower spilled their dirtiest thoughts into the candlelit air, while Rasputin listened like a wolf disguised as a priest. Next came the so-called sacrament, acts of flesh meant to exhaust the body and free the soul. Husbands and wives disappeared into corners, strangers clasped each other in breathless rituals, and all of it was declared sacred. Finally came the weeping, a storm of repentance, where the same mouths that moan now beg God for mercy. Then the cycle began again, night after night, until guilt itself became a drug. Rasputin stood at the center of it all, the conductor of this grotesque orchestra. He claimed his body carried a divine essence that could lift souls closer to heaven. Women, peasants, and society wives alike competed for the privilege of his touch, convinced that lying with him was the ultimate sacrament. They didn't just break their vows, they believed they were serving God by breaking them. It was spiritual corruption, so perfectly packaged it almost sounded holy. Authorities tried to crush the gatherings. Police raided barns, priests denounced him from pulpits, newspapers dripped warnings like venom. But Rasputin thrived on persecution. Every attempt to stop him became proof of his righteousness. Had not Christ himself been hunted? To his followers, every arrest was another sign that their filthy prophet walked the true path. They clung tighter, sang louder, sinned harder. By the time he reached St. Petersburg, Rasputin had perfected the art of making depravity look like destiny. The salons of the capital, stuffed with perfumed nobles starving for something real, were the perfect next stage. Whispered rumors of holy gatherings spread like a fever through drawing rooms. Women who once fainted at the sight of a bare ankle now sneaked from glittering dinner parties to freezing barns, desperate to taste the forbidden sacrament. They returned to their palaces flushed and trembling, swearing they had touched the divine. Rasputin called it worship. The rest of Russia called it blasphemy. But in the half-light of those secret nights, the distinction dissolved. He had discovered a formula more explosive than gunpowder: sin as salvation, humiliation as glory, and desire as a straight shot to God. And with every ecstatic chant, every whispered confession, every breathless act of purification, his legend grew stronger than any sermon the Orthodox priest could muster. The empire had no defense for a man who turned shame into power. While bishops debated doctrine and ministers counted their bribes, Rasputin built a congregation of the damned, men and women who believed their dirt could buy heaven. By the time the capital's elites finally caught the scent, the holy infection was already inside their walls, and no prayer could scrub it out. By the time the Great War tore across Europe, Russia's government was no longer guided by generals or ministers. It was being steered by a filthy mystic who barely knew how to read. Rasputin, the unwashed peasant who preached salvation through dirt, had muscled his way into the engine room of an empire. Through the Tsarina's desperate devotion, he became the whisper behind every order, the shadow signing every decree. What began as a sick boy's miracle cure had evolved into a national infection. When Nicholas II marched off to command troops at the front in 1915, he left the home front in the trembling hands of his wife. Alexandra did nothing without consulting her holy man. That single choice turned Rasputin from a stinking curiosity into the puppet master of the largest empire on earth. Ministers, generals, even bishops found their fates dangling from the greasy strings of a peasant who smelled like goat meat and vodka. Appointments, dismissals, military orders, none of it moved without his nod. And Rasputin sold those nods like a marketplace peddler hawking rotten fruit. Need a bishopric? Pay the holy man. Want a cabinet seat? Slip a bribe and a groveling prayer under his lice-ridden robe. He kept notebooks filled with names, debts, and favors owed, a private ledger of corruption written in sloppy peasant scrawl. Court officials watched in disbelief as competent administrators were tossed aside in favor of Rasputin's drinking buddies, business partners, and whoever paid the highest price. Russia's bureaucracy turned into a bazaar of bought souls. His political advice was just as rancid as his smell. Rasputin opposed the war, not out of compassion, but because he claimed God whispered that Russia would lose. When generals begged for reinforcements, he declared the stars unfavorable and urged retreat. Strategy became seance. Cabinet meetings dissolved into theater, as ministers found themselves arguing policy with a man who claimed to consult dead saints before approving troop movements. Soldiers bled out on frozen battlefields while a barn-scented mystic overruled trained commanders with drunken prophecies. Foreign powers could hardly believe their luck. German intelligence didn't need to infiltrate Russian high command. The empire was already sabotaging itself under Rasputin's divine guidance. Each disastrous appointment, each ill-timed retreat, each bribe-soaked decision pushed Russia closer to collapse. And through it all, Rasputin swaggered through government halls like a mud-stained Caesar, laughing at the polished men forced to bow before his holy filth. The more the empire rotted, the tighter Alexandra clung to him. Every failure only deepened her faith. Critics were traitors, warnings were lies, and the stinking prophet remained the sole light in a darkening world. Ministers who questioned him were dismissed. Generals who defied him were replaced. The Romanov dynasty, once the granite foundation of Russian power, now rested on the shifting mud of a peasant's whims. Rasputin knew exactly how far he'd climbed. He barged into meetings uninvited, interrupted discussions with drunken proclamations, and waved away objections with claims of divine revelation. He spoke with the arrogance of a man who believed the spirits themselves co-signed every order. When someone dared to challenge him, he smiled that wolfish smile and reminded them, politely, almost sweetly, that the Tsarina would hear of their disloyalty by nightfall. Outside the palace walls, soldiers muttered in trenches, workers starved in frozen streets, and revolution festered like a wound. Inside, a filthy peasant steered an empire toward ruin with the confidence of a prophet and the morals of a street thief. By 1916, even his former allies realized that killing Rasputin might be the only way to save Russia from itself. But Rasputin, drunk on power and vodka, didn't care. He had clawed his way from Siberian mud to the nerve center of an empire, and he intended to squeeze until the Romanovs either obeyed or bled. The holy man of filth was now Russia's most dangerous weapon, aimed not at enemies abroad, but at the heart of his own nation. By the winter of 1916, Even Rasputin's drinking partners were plotting his death. Ministers, nobles, and generals finally agreed on one thing. The stinking holy man had to be erased before he dragged the empire into the grave with him. But killing Rasputin was never going to be simple. He had spent years bragging of divine protection, and fate seemed to indulge his arrogance. The assassination plot that followed reads less like history and more like a demon's practical joke. Prince Felix Yusupov, heir to one of Russia's richest families, staged the trap. The plan was idiot-proof on paper. Invite Rasputin to a midnight party at the Yusupov palace, feed him pastries and wine laced with enough cyanide to kill a cavalry regiment. Wait for the poison to finish its work, dispose of the body, and toast the empire's salvation. Simple, elegant, fatal. They forgot they were dealing with a man who treated death like an annoying mosquito. Rasputin arrived just after midnight, eyes glittering with suspicion, but too arrogant to turn back. He devoured the poisoned cakes, drained the poisoned wine, and nothing. Minutes stretched into hours. Upstairs, the conspirators waited for the thud of a collapsing body. Instead, they heard singing. Rasputin was downstairs humming folk songs and demanding more wine, as if cyanide were nothing more than seasoning. Panic spread. Yusupov, sweating through his silk, finally grabbed a revolver and shot the mad monk in the chest. Rasputin fell, seemingly lifeless. The killers exhaled, certain the nightmare was over. They celebrated too soon. When Yusupov crept back to admire his work, the corpse opened its eyes. Rasputin surged to his feet and lunged for the prince, staggering toward the courtyard like a man rising from hell. Terrified, the assassins fired again and again. 3 more bullets slammed into his body. Still, he crawled across the snow, leaving a black trail of blood, trying to escape. They beat him with clubs, tied him up, and finally hurled him through a hole in the frozen Neva River. Only when the autopsy came back did the true horror emerge. Rasputin had drowned. Despite poison, bullets, and a savage beating, his lungs were filled with river water. The man who claimed God's protection had refused to die until the ice itself swallowed him. Even in death, Rasputin refused silence. Before the assassination, he had written a letter predicting that if nobles killed him, the Romanov dynasty would collapse within 2 years, and the royal family would die violently. The letter was dismissed as the ravings of a drunk peasant. 2 months later, revolution erupted across Russia. Nicholas II, Tsar of a realm that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, was forced to abdicate. The Romanovs, who once ruled by divine right, became prisoners in their own palaces. Rasputin's prophecy went further. He warned that the Tsar's entire family would be slaughtered. 18 months after his death, Bolshevik executioners dragged Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children into a basement in Yekaterinburg and gunned them down. The last words on Alexandra's lips, witnesses whispered, were Rasputin's name. The dynasty that survived Napoleon, plagues, and centuries of rebellion crumbled exactly as the mad monk foretold. Historians still argue whether Rasputin was a supernatural seer or just a man who understood the political rot he had helped create. Maybe he simply read the cracks in the empire better than anyone else. Maybe he really believed God whispered the future into his filthy ear. What cannot be argued is the timing. His death lit the fuse that blew the Romanovs off the map. In the end, Rasputin's greatest seduction wasn't of duchesses or Tsarinas. It was of destiny itself. He proved that in a world obsessed with Polish and power, a single unwashed peasant, armed with charisma, corruption, and a stench that could fell an ox, could bring an empire to its knees. Poison couldn't kill him. Bullets couldn't stop him. Even the river had to finish the job. And long after his body froze beneath the ice, the chaos he unleashed kept breathing, tearing Russia apart exactly as he promised.